But there's a song that goes, I don't want to get adjusted to this world. I got a home that's so much better. I'm going to get to sooner or later. I don't want to get adjusted to this world. Now, the home sooner or later was supposed to be heaven, but for me, it was a better world. Whether it's necessarily communist, I can't say. Socialist, I don't know. But I do know I don't want to get adjusted to this world. I don't want to be adjusted because it's the world that exterminated my parents' family. I don't want to be part of the system as it works. And I will, whether it succeeds or not, I'll never know. But I'll keep fighting against it because what's the alternative? To walk away?
On the 7th of October 2023, the conflict, or as some call it, the occupation of Palestine, specifically Gaza, by Israel, was projected to the forefront of the global conversation. Everybody started talking about it, and pretty much they haven't stopped since. But of course, that wasn't when things started. The story of Israel-Palestine goes back a century or more. The Zionist story further still. And many people, long before 2023, have tried to make sense of what Israel is doing in Palestine, its endgame, the ideology that drives it, and the specific details of what the occupation of Palestine actually looks like. In all of that, in the Anglophone world at least, nobody comes near my guest today. Nobody active anyway. His mentor was Noam Chomsky. His PhD was on Zionism. And really since the early 1980s, he has been a central critical voice in the United States regarding Israel and how it conducts itself. He has been reinvigorated by a world of YouTube videos and social media clicks, but he remains very much a literary figure. His research is second to none. His commitment is to intellectual life and getting the details right. That's certainly the case in his newest book, which investigates the ongoing genocide of Gaza. I say it a lot, but this time it really is absolutely warranted. He needs no introduction at all. Norman Finkelstein, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
Can I start by talking about your parents? They were Holocaust survivors. You've talked about them many times. People like to focus on one's credentials, your PhD at Princeton and whatnot. But I think that's probably the best place to start in terms of your worldview on these things. Who were they and what was their life experience?
That's a large question. It's actually a small question. It's large because they loomed so large in my life, but small because I never knew many details about them before the war. We just never discussed it. We discussed the war as a political phenomenon, as a philosophical meditation. But when it was the details of their families, it just was taboo. Don't ask me when I learned that, but I could say neither my brothers nor I know anything about them personally. They were both in Warsaw. I understand that my father's father owned a lumber mill. My mother's father owned a tobacco store. My mother's family was solidly in the middle class. She went to very good schools. She studied Latin, mathematics. She went to Warsaw University in 1937, I believe. And I know my mother had two sisters and a brother. My father, I think, had a brother and a sister. And other than that, I know that my mother's father was intensely religious. As my mother would say, worse than 10 rabbis. And even though my mother revered her father, he was just apparently a solid human being. He was totally steeped in religion, and she held him in part responsible for what befell them, because as a member of the Polish middle class, when Poland was divided between the Soviet Union and Germany, they did have the resources to flee. But my mother's father said, God will never let anything happen to the Jews. And, it was more of a resentment at the fact that he believed in God. She revered him, but that this is probably the wrong metaphor. That cured her of any belief in religion, as was the case for my father. They were resolutely, adamantly atheist, to the point of people like Dawkins and Harris nowadays, to the point anyone who possibly believes in religion has to be an idiot. I don't have that point of view, but that was them.
And so how old were they when they went to the United States?
Well, they were in the Warsaw Ghetto. The ghetto uprising was put down in April 1943. The survivors, the estimates, when I give numbers or figures, it's based on the scholarship up until about 25 years ago. I stopped reading about it. So the scholarship could be dated. There were about 20,000 survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. They were deported to Majdanek concentration camp. My father ended up in Auschwitz and was in the Auschwitz Death March. My mother ended up in 2 slave labor camps. She was liberated by the Russians, my father by the Americans.
And what age were they when they went to the United States? Were they early 30s, late 20s?
My mother was born in 1920, my father in 1919. And I believe they came over in 1947, so roughly 27 years old.
And they met one another in Poland, or?
Again, I don't know the details, but apparently my mother did know my father before the war. We never discussed it. Somehow my mother saw my father's sister in Majdanek concentration camp. So how she knew it was my father's sister, I don't know. But I do know that before the war, my mother's mother had a sister in the United States. And the sister, my mother's mother, sent pictures to her sister. So about 5 pictures were preserved of my mother's family. But my father had no, there was nothing left. There was no pictures, no nothing. And every once in a while during the marriage, my father would turn to my mother and say, "Tell me what she looked like," which is a reference to my mother having glimpsed my father's sister in the camp, Majdanek. How she knew it was her sister, I don't know. We never, ever discussed anything that happened to them personally.
For their entire lives?
Correct.
And that was a coping mechanism, or they didn't want to relay that to you, or what do you think it was?
Oh, I think it was 2 things. They could not coherently talk about it. There was once, the American broadcaster Amy Goodman, and I knew her quite well, and she had visited my family home several times. And Amy once was interviewing her and asked, "What happened to your family?" And as was my mother's wont or habit, she turned like that, lowered her head, and then said, "Don't ask me about it." And on my part, I didn't think I could emotionally handle it, so I didn't want to know. It was like it was going to open up a sluice gate, and the water would come pouring forth, and I never believed I could handle that. So I kind of didn't want to know.
What kind of family were you growing up then? Because you're obviously a Jewish family in the United States, but you're not historically American Jews. How did you kind of collectively self-identify as parents, as kids?
We didn't. Being a Holocaust survivor was a very different thing before Israel became a part of American life. It was an object of shame and humiliation because the image of Jews after World War II was popularized as the Jews went like sheep to slaughter. So it was a source of huge humiliation. That, by the way, I don't want to get lost on tangents, but that was one of the attractions of Israel to American Jews, because Israel always promoted itself as the Jewish fighter. And then along comes Moshe Dayan, the head of the Israeli army. He's got a patch. He looks like a pirate. He's a womanizer. And so for American Jews, it was like really thrilling because it was a way for them to free themselves from the burden of having gone like sheep to slaughter. And the other side was, it was assumed that if you were a survivor, you had to have done something dirty to survive. And my mother would get incensed during, when people would ask her, and I think, my opinion, probably mostly with innocence, when they would ask her, how did you survive? And she always felt there was an insinuation there that she must have done something dirty. And I'll tell you the truth. I did once. I remember my mother was at the ironing board. And I was curious. I said, Mom, did you ever do anything that you're ashamed of in retrospect? And she was emphatic. No. Now, of course, you would expect anyone to say that. But I believed her, and I'll tell you why I believed her. My parents loathed collaborators. The technical term was the capos, those who cooperated with the Nazis. They would get livid because all the Jews hated the capos. And they hated what were called, the Jews who passed through the experience. It was a curse if you were called Judenrat. Judenrat technically is just the German word for Jewish council. If you sat on the Jewish council, you were the Judenrat. And whenever you referred to a collaborator, it was the Judenrat. And it was the dirtiest curse word to say Judenrat, collaborator. So given the level of indignation that they would summon forth against capos and Judenrat, and they would have very vivid descriptions. When the Warsaw Ghetto was being formed, the Jews built the catacombs inside the ghetto, the tunnels. They were called, the technical term they used was the bunkers. And they had to do it pretty much by hand. There weren't instruments. They built this very sophisticated, ramified system of bunkers, like the Gaza tunnels. And Jewish collaborators. It's true, I know. I'll just say as a fact, I discuss these sorts of details a lot at home. And sometimes I thought maybe my parents were exaggerating a little here or there. And then as I started to read the scholarly literature, memoirs and things like that, it all was confirmed. I can name the books if at some point you're curious. In any event, they would say that Jews would point out to the Nazis where were the bunkers. Their own families, their own family. And throughout my parents' life, they would just be so bewildered. How could you point out the bunkers of your own family to survive, to save yourself? So I have to believe, not because of a personal connection, that when she said nothing, she did say to me, I was once offer the position of being what was called a blockhead, not blockhead, one word, a blockhead, meaning the concentration camp was divided up into blocks. And the person responsible for each block was Jewish, was an inmate. And she said she turned it down. On the other hand, and she probably wouldn't like it if I said this, but I want to be strictly honest. She said, many people said, if you read Primo Levi, it became kind of a cliche. The best did not survive. The best did not survive. What did that mean? If you were refined, if you were cultured, if you were civilized, if you couldn't, it went against your, if you were delicate, it went against your grain to fight in the lines. You know, they would have a big vat of soup. The soup contained 99% water with a few vegetables. In order to get the vegetable, you had to shove. You had to shove. Otherwise, you die. So that's what it meant. The best did not survive. If you were too delicate, you couldn't survive. And I did notice growing up in like the supermarket, by the delicatessen section, there would be a large number of people gathered to buy delicatessen. At some point, they installed numbers. So to get your turn, but before the numbers, I noticed she pushed a lot. Shamelessly, embarrassingly to me. I didn't understand where it was coming from. But I figured she got that from the camp. The struggle to survive. And absolutely, unabashedly, didn't give a darn what anybody thought. I'm getting to the head of the line. I figured that part, it seems, maybe they would deny it now, but I think that probably came from the camp.
What qualities do you think you get from your parents? Because you have this, from my perspective anyway, obviously not everybody thinks this about you. From my perspective, you have a kind of pathological commitment to the truth, often in a way that can be self-destructive. Not that you're trying to self-destroy, but it's clearly not in your own rational personal interest. Does that come from them, or is that from just another part of your life that was...
No, that doesn't come from them. I guess where that comes from is, if I weren't passionately committed to truth, then there would be no point to what I'm doing. You see, what do? I get human rights reports. I get books. I go through them once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, trying to figure out where somebody's lying, where somebody's telling the truth. So the whole point of my existence for the past 43 years has been to ferret out the truth. So if I weren't committed to truth, then why am I doing what I'm doing? It would make no sense.
But where does that come from? Because you were doing your PhD at Princeton, you were an up-and-coming academic, very smart guy. Lots of people are like that, but then they don't pursue the path you have. So I wonder where that comes from.
Oh, that part is very simple. As I told you, growing up in my house, my parents, the worst epithet they would hurl at anybody, traitor. They were diehard to the last day of their lives. They were Stalinists, totally beholden to Stalin. In my home, because you asked me how did I get along growing up, it wasn't just the Holocaust background. My parents were, long after everybody agreed Stalin did horrible things, my parents would never acknowledge it. And when slowly but surely people they knew turned against the Soviet Union, my father would just mutter under his breath, traitor. They had, you talked about at the cost of self-interest. They didn't give a darn what anybody thought. They would never say a word against the Soviet Union. Now, I think a large part of it was misguided, in my opinion. On the other hand, I respected the fact that they would never sell out. Now, they liked money. For sure, they liked money. And there was a period when the Holocaust industry was going full steam ahead, and that issue of the Holocaust became linked to the issue of Jews in the Soviet Union, the Soviet Jewry issue, as it was called, letting Jews leave, let my people go. That was the slogan. So in order to speak publicly about the Nazi Holocaust, you had to denounce the Soviet Union. You had to denounce the Soviet Union. They went hand in hand. This is what I experienced during the war, and now we have the free Soviet Jewry. And you could have made money there, because I said it was a lucrative business, this whole Holocaust industry.
How was it lucrative?
They paid you a lot. My parents were the real thing. They were actually real survivors. Most of the people who said they were survivors are not survivors. They were in the Soviet Union during the war or something like that. My parents were the real thing, and there weren't that many. So you can get speaking fees, you can get engagements and things like that. If the price were denouncing the Soviet Union, forget it. It would never happen. And, you could see they were uncontrollable on that question. They felt, and as I say, it has a positive and negative side, they felt a deep debt to the Soviet Union because the simple fact is they won the war. You can, scream till the cows come home. Britain lost about 400,000 people. The United States lost about, the numbers vary, but you can say 300,000 during World War II. Russia lost 27 million. So quantity turns into quality. And they always felt the Russian people understood war. They felt a deep sympathy. My father, at the end of his life, he became fluent in Russian. There was a deep sense of affinity with the Russians because they felt the Russians were the only ones who understood what they went through. And as a factual matter, when Israel was being born in 1947 or being created, by far and away the most moving speech was by Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko in the General Assembly when they were debating whether or not what to do with the Palestine question. And finally, the issue of the partition came up. And Gromyko, who was very hard-nosed, remember he's Stalin's foreign secretary, so he couldn't have been one of those best, refined, delicate. No, that's not Gromyko. But he said, nobody suffered like the Jews during World War II, which is a very generous statement coming from the foreign minister of a country that lost 30 million people. He said the suffering of the Jewish people was in a category all its own. And that was deeply felt by Jews around the world, Gromyko's speech. Nobody remembers any of the other speeches. And that was, for my parents, a recognition. The Russians understood what we went through. So they were very loyal, faithful, and I internalized that you don't betray. You can change your mind. Even though my parents never believed that others changed their minds, they blew with the wind, which is different than changing your mind. But I would never utter an opinion because it was opportune. And I would change if you convinced me, say, an argument I make in a book, the argument is wrong-headed. Okay, I can be persuaded. But if you gave me a check for $10,000 and you said, change that comma to a period, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. My words are not for sale. My punctuation is not for sale.
Does it happen a lot? In American public life, are people getting paid money to move arguments here or there?
No, people get paid money to write other people's books, and that helps. That happens a lot, not least among professors. And of course, there is the fact that it's called piggybacking. When you have a book which is a bestseller, you immediately want to get another book out that's a bestseller. But that first book took you 10 years. So there's a little assistance in getting that second book out so you can piggyback. That's that kind of corruption in academic life. But just as a matter of principle for me, the words aren't for sale.
I hope you're enjoying watching this Downstream episode as much as I'm enjoying having this conversation with Norman Finkelstein, just an incredible person. So grateful to talk to him about all of these issues. Here at Novara Media, we get to talk to some of the most fascinating people about the most important debates. Norman is pretty much up there, isn't he? But we don't just have these conversations here on YouTube. We have events and, more recently, a newsletter too. If you want to subscribe to that newsletter, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter. We talk about the process behind these interviews. We talk about the generation of questions. Often you'll find anecdotes and vignettes which aren't really captured on camera. Recommended reading too, either by a guest or by Ash or myself. Really valuable newsletter. I think I love newsletters. My wife complains that I read far too many of them. So why don't you have Novara Media's Downstream newsletter join your highly manicured, polished online reading? Like I say, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter. The link is in the description below. You've talked about, I think you call them Jewish supremacist billionaires, a Jewish supremacist billionaire class. Mm-hmm. Basically doling out money and favors to people to say certain things and to make certain arguments. And if they don't do that, it's not just the carrot, there's also the stick. They punish people.
Your doors are closed.
Are those people trying to effectively capture the American political debate and US foreign policy debates in order to serve the interests of Israel?
I think that there's a recognition that there was a long time where Israel felt it could win the public debate. It had huge resources. One of the differences between, say, the struggle with South Africa and the Palestine question is South Africa never really tried to win an intellectual debate. It wasn't possible. You can't defend apartheid in the middle of the civil rights movement. That's not going to happen. You are intellectually disarmed from the get-go. We're dismantling what you are consolidating. And we're dismantling it in a very big way. There's a whole civil rights movement, civil rights legislation, and all of it is predicated on dismantling apartheid. And so it's not, South Africa never really tried to defend it, to make a case for itself. In the case of Israel, there was a voluminous, relentless churning out of written material to defend its case. And for the longest time, they were winning. It was a very tough battle.
When did they stop winning?
It's a good question. When exactly they started to lose. I first got involved publicly in the Israel-Palestine conflict when I demonstrated that a national bestseller on the Israel-Palestine conflict was a book called From Time Immemorial, and it had all the endorsements of the who's who of the American intellectual community, which is essentially the American Jewish intellectual community. They overlap by about 90%. I demonstrated it was a hoax. It was a book called From Time Immemorial. And that was still a very early period because there were only a few people on the other side who were actually working on the propaganda being churned out, working on it in a systematic way. It was not just slogans like Zionism is racism, but sitting down and going through it. Obviously, the first person, there were a few people in the 1950s, but the first person who did it in a very sophisticated, impressive way was, of course, Noam Chomsky. His book, The Fateful Triangle, was really a landmark There's an excellent review of it. The book came out in 1983, and there was an excellent review of it by Edward Said in the London Review of Books. And it was sharp. It was a shrewd review. And he said at one point that Chomsky is a unique figure in the history of the great minds of Western civilization. And what made him unique was his mastery of detail. When you read people like Bertrand Russell or a large number of others, they tended towards the broad overview. Chomsky was unique. He focused on the micro detail. And I think Said's expression was his staggering grasp of the detail. And that was a style that I came to imitate to the point of, I think, what was the word you used to describe me? Insanity or something?
I said self-destructive, pathologically committed to the truth.
Oh, I would say it became, at a certain point, it could fairly be described as pathological, this investment in unturning every fact, going through things very methodically. The first book I was part of was edited by Professor Said and Christopher Hitchens. It was called Blaming the Victims. And it came out at like the perfect time. It came out in 1989, just at the start of the first Intifada. So it sold very, very well, the book. And my mother was a voracious reader. And she said, Norman, I read that book twice. I read every chapter in that book except yours. She said, your prose is like molasses pouring out of a bottle. And I didn't take offense to it at all because there was some truth to it. That's my style. I was ruthless in trying to track down every falsehood. I felt like I was doing something that nobody else would do. And it would have been suicidal if I'm investing all my time in it to start lying myself. You know why? Because there were a lot of people going through what I was writing to try to discredit me. So it was a kind of self-survival technique or a survival technique to stay scrupulously honest. Otherwise, I mean, to the point of craziness. I now have the good fortune, being better known, that if I post on my website, I need fact checkers, I'll get 100 people who will volunteer. And I don't trust any of them because I don't think anyone's just going to be as fanatical about it. So since I have like 100, and let's say I have 5 chapters in the book, I'll ask 10 or 15 to do each chapter. So what one person misses, another person will get, and then you get the idea to go over it again and then again and again. I don't want any errors. But as I said, part of it is I really do believe in the truth. And part of it is the way it always works in academic life is this book is replete, is full of errors. But for reasons of space, I can only cite 2. So you get hung if they find 2 errors, because you don't know if 2 is the end, or the reader doesn't know if 2 is the end or just the beginning. So you have to make sure you don't even have 2 errors. And I would say the books have held up.
You've called yourself kind of old-fashioned. You read a lot. You don't really do podcasts. You obviously have massive accounts on social media, but you're... I have the person present in the room now. She's my webmaster. Yeah.
I've never been on the social media.
You're a very literary person. That's just self-evident.
I wouldn't say that. I would just say that I take that part seriously. I right now, if you watch like the breakup of what's called MAGA, this kind of insurgency by people who are critical of Israel and things like that. The whole thing, it's just gossip. It's Megyn Kelly said this. Tucker Carlson said that. Nick Fuentes said this. Candace Owens said that. There's no politics.
You say that. Your interview with Candace Owens was really good. I thought it was really substantial, actually. It was 2.5 hours. I was kind of like, wow, this is quite politically substantial.
I did my best to address substantive issues with a new audience and not to be distracted by things which I didn't agree with, but I didn't see any point in going on the show to then just stomp out in indignation. So I try to maximize the utility in terms of reach.
So in terms of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, that Magasphere you called it,
Yeah.
Nick Fuentes, you don't think there's anything that's kind of politically vital going on amongst those people?
No, I think it's been reduced to gossip.
So it was something else, and it's been reduced to that because of how Trump mediatizes everything, or
I don't know. I think a lot of it is just the social media and people vying for an audience. And I'm not saying ego didn't play a role in the past and money didn't play a role in the past, compensation didn't play a role in the past. But I do think if you look at the quality of the thinkers, say what you want about what came to be called the neoconservatives, okay? They were intellectually substantial. You could say it was all propaganda, it was all ideology, but they were a formidable phalanx of thinkers. You can't say that now. If I were to ask, name me a significant publication by that podcaster community, something that really makes you think, something that's original. Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Ben Shapiro.
I mean, he's the dumbest of the lot, right?
I don't watch him enough to say one way or another, but I do know that there is a confusion there between a tweet and an argument. A tweet is not an argument. An argument is not easy to construct. An argument it's mentally taxing to figure something out and trying to arrange it to make it coherent, evidence proof. It's not an easy thing. It's mentally very exhausting. Now, maybe greater minds do it with more facility than me, but I know that it's the hardest part. When you write something, writing has three discrete stages: research, organization, composition. 3 basic stages. It used to be thought when you're younger, the toughest stage is the research. Oh, I got to read this, and I got to read that, and I have to read this. Actually, the research stage is the easiest. Composition, the third stage, the words come. Now, they may not all come out as poetry, and the words may come out clunky, but they come. Once you're clear in the argument, the words come. The tough part is the organization. How do you make coherent sense of all the information you've gathered? How do you organize it? That's very tough. It's mentally very exhausting. But you don't face that if your whole output, intellectual output, is tweets. You don't have to organize anything. So if I were to ask you, name me something substantial that they have produced. Megyn Kelly?
J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy.
I read, by sheer happenstance, somebody gave me the book. I read it. It was completely vacuous. And it was funny coming from J.D. Vance, our current vice president, because you know what the premise of the book was? All those people, all those poor white people, they're losers. That was the essence of the book. They brought it on themselves. They are, as we used to call it in the United States, they're all white trash. And he made it because, even though he came from the same background, because he was special. It's very funny, considering where he's now. The book was dumping on the whole base of the Trump phenomenon, the quote unquote white trash.
But the criticism you're making about the American right, the MAGA saying they're descending into gossip, I love that line. Mm-hmm. Isn't that just broadly true about the entirety of our culture? The sort of the increased banality of certainly Anglophone culture as an outgrowth of moving to social first, particularly vertical video, personality over substantive ideology, et cetera, et cetera. That's a problem for everybody, right? Or you think it's peculiarly a problem for...
I would say just at the current moment, I've noticed that it's just descended into personalities. And, you'll have Megyn Kelly interviewing Tucker Carlson about what Tucker Carlson thinks about Ben Shapiro.
I think I saw this video 2 days ago, right?
It's like, do you really care?
But people buy tickets and watch this stuff.
I know.
That's the crazy thing.
I know. And that's why I don't feel I have any connection to that culture. It's intellectually void.
But what about the left? Because your book before this one was about identity politics and the failures of the left. Do you think the left's any better?
Well, I think the identity politics left was completely vacuous, and I go on at great length in trying to demonstrate that. Some people will say I went on at too great length in order to try to demonstrate it, but I took the books which were said to be the iconic texts, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Kimberly Crenshaw. I looked through it. There was nothing there. I remember there was the American folk singer, Willie Guthrie, and he said, he was a creature of the Depression, Guthrie, and he said, my soup was so thin, I used to read the morning paper through it. And that's what these people, there's nothing. It's just all sloganeering and posturing. It was completely empty. Now, as to the non-woke left, I can't really say because I've not looked seriously at the scholarship coming out, I would say, on some subjects and things like slavery. And the scholarship is good. It's very good. It's not like it once was because the new generation doesn't read. And if you don't read, you lose. There was a very good columnist on the left. Her name was Katha Pollitt. She's still around, but not. She was a columnist in The Nation. She was once asked, how do you become a good writer? And her answer was very simple. Read, write. That's it. Read, write. If you don't read, you can't write very much of quality. So the quality of the prose is it's dramatically diminished, the quality of the prose. As to the ideas, it's not what it once was. It's hard for the current generation to remember that there was a time when the socialist movement attracted the creme de la creme of the intellectual elite. They were going to be part of the future as it was understood. If you read the biographies of people like Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and them in general, number one, they always graduate first in their class. Every one of them gets the gold medal. Yes, it's true. Bourgeois education, they were always the top of their class, always the gold medal. They all knew languages, many languages. Everyone knew 5 languages. Every one of them knew at least 5 languages. They read literature. They discussed literature. Now, they were not pedantic. They weren't trying to show off their knowledge. It came naturally. You're a leader of the socialist movement because socialism represented the peak of European civilization. You are standing on the shoulders of all of the preceding. So, of course, you read that. You didn't boast about it. You didn't try to show off. It just came with the turf. That's what it meant to be a member of the left. Now, that's all vanished.
Vanished?
Yeah, it's completely vanished.
There's no remnants of it at all?
No, not at all. At least in the current culture. In my day, there were some. I knew them. You know, the generation in the UK, the ones who edited the left-wing. It was an academic left-wing periodical, Past and Present. The E.J. Hobsbawms, the
E.P. Thompson.
Yeah, I was going to say the making of the British working class. E.P. Thompson. They were, brilliant. They were at the top. You don't have that anymore. Not in the left. People who were active in the movement, and also were the leading lights of their intellectually of their generation. That's all gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
Is there anybody on the left in the United States or Europe who excites you, who's young? A writer, a thinker, a politician, and, they make you enthusiastic about the future and about life?
Not really, but that may be my feeling. I may be still too caught up in the past. If I have a choice between reading a contemporary writer and reading Rosa Luxemburg, her books, they're recently being translated, several volumes. I'd rather read her.
When was the last time a contemporary thinker really excited you then?
Oh, that's easy. It was Noam Chomsky.
Right.
Yeah. Chomsky was not just for me, but for a whole generation. He was seminal. It's interesting. I was commenting to my friend who's in the room right now, how quickly his name vanished. Now when you speak to a young audience and you mention Noam Chomsky, you might as well be talking about Abraham Lincoln. They have no real idea.
Do you think?
Yeah. It shows, if you ever have any conceits about being remembered when you die, you see those illusions are dashed when I see, Noam Chomsky, there was the first international, the Marx International, the Marx Engels and Bakunin International. There was the second international, that was the international of the German Social Democratic Party and so forth. Then there was the third international, the Communist International. There was technically a fourth international, Trotsky's fourth international. And then there was a fifth international. And you know what that one was?
Cool.
Chomsky. Yes, there was a Chomsky International. Everywhere in the world, everybody knew him. And everyone you met would say, in the most literal sense, he changed my life. It was a stupendous achievement. Chomsky has many achievements to his name. That one, I think, is among the many, that's one that's not recognized. He had no access to the mainstream media. None. His publishing houses were tiny South End press, tiny little publishing houses. But by relentless travel, relentless commitment, and relentless integrity, he created this whole international. It was, and now, if you mention his name, to young people, you would say ages 30 and under 30 and under. Barely any recognition. Really, barely any. It's what you would call, as I said, if you entertain visions of grandeur, it's a very sobering fact how quickly people are forgotten.
I think that's true, but I'd also say, people are going to be reading his books and your books.
I don't believe that at all.
For hundreds of years.
No.
Of course they will be. There'll be some obscure academic somewhere, and they'll be saying, well, okay, no, Finkelstein, this guy's got some interesting things to say.
You said people, but then it came down to person.
Well, there'll be intellectual communities engaging with your stuff in 100, 200 years.
I find that very implausible, and not because
Why is it implausible?
Not because I'm affecting false modesty. I just don't think I see it now. I see how quickly, if I were to mention now to a young person a major figure in my era, Alexander Coburn. Nobody knows it. Nobody has a clue who he was. And he was actually a prominent name. He was a very smart guy and very funny. He was hilariously funny and very witty at cutting down the pretensions of the dominant intellectuals. There was a famous guy named Norman Podhoretz, and Podhoretz edited this magazine called Commentary Magazine. And he was always attacking communism and critics of Israel. And so his wife, and same thing with his wife, they were a team. And Coburn nicknamed them the Frother and the Frotheratrix. And it really stuck. He would mock, and he was, as I said, he was clever, smart. Nobody knows who he is.
But the difference is we now have video becoming ubiquitous across our culture. Mm-hmm. Now, on the downside, you're right, fragmented attention spans, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, I think people don't just engage with the intellectual output of the person, but also their persona, their charisma. And I do think people, again, you maybe think this is stupid. I think people in 50 years, an academic or whatever, they'll see your debate with Destiny, right, and they'll see you losing it, and they'll say, this guy was really funny. Right. In a way that you said that about Norman Podhoretz or whatever, and I don't.
Fine, but there's one problem. I'm being serious.
Please.
Now. I don't want to be remembered that way. You know, if I walk through the streets of Amman, okay, randomly people come up, recognize me, and what's the first thing they say? Every time, crocodile tears, because of this exchange I had with a woman. I think to myself, I devoted 43 years to reading tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of pages of human rights reports and documents, and all I'm going to be remembered for is that phrase that just slipped from my tongue that required no research, no knowledge whatsoever, crocodile tears. You know, and now I'm getting the same thing with the debate, with that thing called Destiny. You know, that's what people remember. That would be, for me, that's a very, okay, let me put it this way. It's a pitiful and pathetic legacy. It is. If that's
what? It's you. It's like, I think in a way it goes back to pre-modern, pre-literary cultures, right? People are remembered not just for what they were saying, but how they were saying it.
I wonder if
it's something powerful there.
If I were to be remembered, I want to be remembered for struggling very hard to make sense of a situation which on its surface seems simple, but actually is not so simple. And they have to really work through it to figure it out. When October 7th happened, I knew that many people would be curious as to my opinion because I was really the only one who had written on the political history of Gaza. There was Sarah Roy at Harvard, who wrote very excellent economic studies of Gaza, the de-development of Gaza. But I was the only one who had gone through the whole record in painstaking, tedious detail of what had happened politically. So I knew there would be an interest in what I had to say. And suddenly I felt the burden of a huge burden on my shoulders. Because normally, I don't say this proudly, I'm just saying it factually. There was a certain degree to which I was intimidated by Professor Chomsky because he had these formidable powers of logic backed by the fact that he was steeped in Western, and not just Western philosophy, Western moral philosophy. And he had this very refined judgment, this faculty of judgment, but it wasn't just reflexive. It was born of this intense study of not all of human philosophy, but a very wide range of it. You know, it won't include China, it won't include India, but it will include Hebrew philosophy. Actually, you'd be surprised. You know what his major was in college? Arabic. He was an Arabic major when he first went to college. In any event, the long and the short of it was, I both reflexively and fearfully deferred to his judgment. It was hard to argue with him, very hard, because when you disagreed with him, he went at you like a juggernaut. He took no prisoners. He didn't care who it was, his son, his daughter, his wife, his best friend. He was relentless, merciless in proving his point. So I didn't want to face that. A lot of times, if I had disagreements with him and I summoned up the courage to disagree with him, he would start and continue and continue. And at some point, you think to yourself, it's not worth it. Just drop the point and move on. Because he had, among other things, he had unlimited mental energy. So normally, in that situation, I would have asked his opinion, and in 99.5 out of 100 instances, I would have deferred to it. And again, I don't say it proudly. I was already an adult, well past an adult, when I still operated on this protocol, ask Professor Chomsky. But when October 7th came along, he wasn't available. And it was a major moment. And I knew people were wondering what I would say. There would be some people curious, well, what does Finkelstein say? And I sweated for a week trying to make sense of it. I knew inside of me I could not condemn Hamas because I knew too much. I had studied prior to October 7th. I knew what those people in Gaza had endured. And it was just too easy to condemn those people after what happened. I knew I couldn't do it. But having said that, I still had to make sense of what happened. At a factual level, there wasn't much to work on, but there was enough to know something terrible happened. You can try to mitigate it around the edges, but the core remained basically the same. 1,200 people killed, 800 of them are civilians. Something significant had happened. When the massacres during the 1982 Lebanon War, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, originally, the number was low, but the original figure of the number of Palestinians who were slaughtered in Sabra and Shatila was put at 800. Now, it was up later to about 2,000. But even at 800, it was recognized to be a huge slaughter. So when 800 figure pops up on October 7th, you have a problem to wrestle with. You have to be honest about that. And I didn't know how I won't say I was mentally paralyzed, but I do know I sweated to try to figure it out, try to come up with the right formula to understand what happened. And I was start to look at historical works like the slave rebellions and the reaction to them. And then I found an answer which not only did I find satisfactory, but the more I read about the slave rebellions, in particular in the United States, the more it made sense. It wasn't like I hit on something and it was wrong. It was, okay, superficially right, but when you go into the details, it's wrong. No, as I got into the details, actually it seemed more right, what I had to say. So to go back, that's what I would want to be remembered for. That I struggled hard, read widely to try to make sense of what's going on, not crocodile tears, and not calling that thing called destiny Borelli, Morelli, and ravioli. It's funny. I know it makes for witty TikToks, but is that what I want to be remembered for, the sum total of my existence? No. And I'll tell you another thing. I don't want to be remembered as being a Jewish critic of Israel. And I don't want to be remembered as being the son of Holocaust survivors that criticized Israel, because those are the givens. You're just born it. You're born a Jew. In my case, I was born the son of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. There was no input from me. Those are the objective givens. What counts is what you do, not what you are, but what you do. And I want to be remembered for the mental effort. I want to be remembered for, not that I'm going to be remembered, but if I were remembered, it would be for the mental effort and for holding fast in a double sense. One, never succumbing to temptation. And I'll tell you the honest to God truth, that was the easiest part. I was never, ever tempted to sell out. Never even crossed my mind. So I never succumbed to that sort of temptation, and I was never a quitter. I kept going until 2020, when my last book, it sold 370 copies, half of which I had purchased because I was trying to influence a decision at the International Criminal Court. And there was no interest anymore. Gaza had disappeared. It's forgotten now. But by 2023, nobody talked about the Israel-Palestine issue. And it then seemed then it started to feel a little bit pathological. Why am I persisting if nobody's interested? And it doesn't seem like I can affect anything anymore. But up until then, I stuck to it. And I never abandoned my youthful beliefs. What I was when I was 16, I was when I was already in my 70s, in terms of not reconciling myself to the status quo. Now, obviously, my views have changed significantly in politics. I was a Maoist for a significant part of my youth. Obviously, that changed. But the basic belief of there's a African-American, no, I don't know if it's African-American spiritual, but there's a song that goes, I don't want to get adjusted to this world. I got a home that's so much better. I'm going to get to sooner or later. I don't want to get adjusted to this world. Now, the home sooner or later was supposed to be heaven, but for me, it was a better world. Whether it's necessarily communist, I can't say. Socialist, I don't know. But I do know I don't want to get adjusted to this world. I don't want to be adjusted because it's the world that exterminated my parents' family, and I don't want to, I don't want to be part of it. So I was never tempted, never. That I'd rather be remembered. I don't want to be remembered for just the moral part. I do also want to be remembered. I thought hard. I did. I know that. Was it at the level of Spinoza? No. Was it at the level of Professor Chomsky? Of course not. I never had any visions. I never had any distorted visions of myself. I was around him too much. I knew what a stupendous mind was, for 40 years. I was very close to him and his family, at least his wife. So I knew from up close a stupendous mind at work. So I never had any illusions. On the other hand, I felt everybody has some gift or talent. Everybody. And everybody, if they develop that gift or talent, they have something to offer to the world. It's the line in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. He says, the more valuable you become to yourself, the more valuable you become to others. Which basically means if you develop your gift, whatever that gift might be, if you develop it to a very high level, you put in the perspiration, you become more valuable to the world. You're not redundant. You actually, if and when you pass, it will be a loss. It may not be an abyss, but it'll be a loss. And I do believe that everybody has something to contribute. But it requires, as Thomas Edison famously said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I didn't get the 1%. I know that. I don't have to fool myself. But I put in the 97% perspiration, and I was useful. I was useful.
You're talking in the past tense a lot, Norman.
Sure.
You're thinking about mortality a lot.
Well, I always did because I grew up in a morbid home. Mm. I did. It was always death hung in the air. There were these 5 pictures on the wall of this thing called my parents' family, which never really quite grasped what that was. So the death hung. So already at 16, people were always complaining about me because I was always talking about death. But I think that was the family I grew up in.
But there's also a certain, it's interesting you say there's some sort of religiosity in your ancestry. There's a certain mysticism to it. And obviously that eschatological element of socialist or utopian politics, historically, there's real crossover there.
Yeah.
And talking to you, you do kind of feel like a mystic. Even though, and there's so many contradictions here, because on the one hand, your books and your most recent book is all about the data and you're going through the details. But at the same time, most of the world who knows who you are sees this very charismatic, funny, captivating person on a TV screen. And those are quite different things.
That's correct.
And I suppose this is another example of that. You're saying you're a secular atheist,
I am.
Former Maoist. But in a way, there's maybe an alternate timeline where Norman Finkelstein is this quite, religious, mystical, maybe quasi-irrational man,
I remember I had my professor in graduate school. His name was Sheldon Wolin, and he was one of the leading political theorists in the United States. And the question came up once of Karl Marx. Was Marx and Marxism fundamentally a religion? It talked about this thing called communism, which sounds a lot like heaven. It talked about historical inevitability, sounds a lot like religion. And if you ask Professor Chomsky, who was a stern critic of Marx, he would say, quote, Marxism was a chapter in the history of organized religion. That's how he put it. And so once Professor Wolin was asked, not by myself, but by somebody else, he said, do you consider that Marx was a religious figure? He said, well, it doesn't really make sense because Marx was so self-consciously not religious that to ascribe to him that kind of intellectual profile, it just didn't work. I'm not religious. And part of not being religious is that the whole portion of Marxism, which had a religious tint to it, what they called historical inevitability. That's no longer part of the left. Nobody believes you can fight for socialism, you can fight for a better world, but nobody believes it's inevitable. And that's one of the crises of the left. A lot of why people gave their lives for the cause, because they believed the cause was inevitable and they were playing a role in bringing about this inevitability. Now, obviously, there's a contradiction there too. If it's inevitable, then why are you playing a role? It should just happen. But without the belief in the historical inevitability, the left loses a lot of its attraction. When you read people like Rosa Luxemburg, in her times where everybody's despairing, let's say with the breakout of World War I, the collapse of the Second International, soldiers, workers on both sides are killing each other. Workers, they were part of the International. And now the French, the Germans are killing each other. And there was every grounds for being hopelessly despondent, hopelessly despairing. And when you read it, that's the left was. And she would always say, I retain my faith in the subterranean forces at work, which come what may, will still bring about the socialist revolution. So that was her solace, that there were forces at play. And of course, there's a large element of religion in that, but it wasn't in her mind religion. She studied Marxist economics. Actually, she was one of the first female PhDs in economics in the world. So it had a secular veneer, but it certainly had a religious undercurrent, this notion of historical inevitability. I don't have that. Many people get angry at me when I say I think Gaza is over, it's gone. There's nothing left. And people want me to do what Rosa Luxemburg did, to find hope, the subterranean forces, the inevitability that the Palestinians will win. You know, all that language, which is the language of the left for a large part of the end of the 19th and then the 20th century. I don't believe that. I don't, when people say, the famous line by Mao Zedong, which was popular in my generation, the line was, a just cause is bound to win. Or Martin Luther King's, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I don't believe that at all.
You get that a lot, don't you, of, Gaza will be free.
Yeah, I know. I don't believe that.
And there have been hundreds of nations utterly decimated by history.
Yeah, as in how the United States was formed.
Yeah.
So I don't believe those things. So if I don't believe in the historical inevitability, and as I say, the religious aspect to it, what sustains me? What sustains me is very simple. I don't want to get adjusted to this world. I don't want to be part of the system as it works. And I will, whether it succeeds or not, I'll never know, but I'll keep fighting against it because I don't want to be I don't want to be a part of, as in the ruling elite, and I don't want to acquiesce in, not an active promoter of injustice, but I don't want to acquiesce in it. So I'll keep fighting for truth. Victories are so tiny. They're so tiny. About 2.5 weeks ago, the International Court of Justice, it ruled that Israel has to cooperate with UNRWA. First of all, it's a very strange case to bring before the ICJ whether Israel has to cooperate with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the major humanitarian organization in Gaza. And the vote was 10-1 in favor. I was kind of shocked because Israel has spent 2 years demonizing UNRWA. They worked with Hamas, they were part of October 7th, blah, 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 blah. So I figure these justices are never going to order Israel to cooperate with UNRWA. And you know what? The vote was 10-1. And I was almost teary-eyed. Stupidest thing in the world. First of all, Israel's not going to listen. Second of all, the United States obviously is not going to listen. But that's the most you can hope for right now. These tiny, tiny victories. But then what's the alternative? To walk away? To acquiesce in it? No. So it's not religion that drives me forward. It's the refusal to participate in a system which at one point in time exterminated my parents' family. And this point in time gives no future to young people. Nothing. 80% of our country has no future. I'm speaking about the United States. And if it's a choice between fighting for their right to a better future, their right to a life, versus joining the 20%, I'll fight with them. I will. But I don't believe, as I said, it has any religious aspect to it. And I can't say, as I said with Marx, it's counter-rational to accuse him of being religious, given he was so committed to a non-religious worldview. And the same thing with me. To call me mystical, I don't take it as an insult, not at all. But there isn't.
Spinoza was, prone to it.
But I don't have a mystical bone in my body. I sit there and to the point of just sheer boredom, just talking about facts. Now, of course, facts have to be interpreted. They have to be interpreted through a moral and legal, but moral most importantly, a moral filter. Facts don't prove anything in and of themselves. That was one of the deceptions, and I don't think of it as a intentional or a pernicious deception, but that was what was very deceptive about Professor Chomsky. Chomsky made it look like, here are the facts, and therefore they inexorably lead to this political conclusion. No, they don't. The facts can point to a large number of political conclusions. There was always the intermediate step. That step was called judgment, political judgment. And he never formally acknowledged that between the facts and his political conclusion, there was the faculty of judgment. Facts in and of themselves don't. I acknowledge what happened on October 7th. I'll accept the facts because right now there's no new information to lead me to reconsider what happened on October 7th. I'll accept 400 combatants were killed, 800 civilians overwhelmingly killed by Hamas. I'll accept that. But then between that and your political judgment or your moral judgment, it has to be filtered. And I reached a different conclusion than others about October 7th, that you can condemn the act. However, I wouldn't condemn Hamas.
You compare what they did on October 7th to Nat Turner's rebellion, right?
Yeah, I think it was, Nat Turner was born, he lived, and he was destined to die a slave. And it was a fate that he refused. He engaged in the rebellion. The order given by him as they marched out, he and I guess about 40, 50 people, was kill all white people. That was the order that was given. Now, if you fast forward to the present, in large parts of academic life, I won't say everyone, but Nat Turner is acclaimed a hero. Now, some of them might not know exactly what he did, that he killed babies and killed
It was really grim, right?
Oh, yeah, it was very...
There was no...
taking babies and tossing them into the fireplace, But...
And this is just for people who want to know, this is the 1830s. So
1831.
Decades before the Civil War.
Right. And he was right. It was 1831. Civil War doesn't come till 1861, he would have died a slave, born, living and languishing as a slave. And he refused that fate. If you know the actual history of Gaza, it's not very different. They were born into what was described at the very beginning, before Israel occupied Gaza. It was already being described as a concentration camp. And then the Israelis described it as a concentration camp. And by 2023, by October 6th, 2023, it looked like they were going to die in a concentration camp. They were born into it. You know, most of the people who burst the gates of Gaza were in the early 20s. Because if you were older, you already had a family. And then they wouldn't have volunteered to be among those who burst the gates of Gaza because they had family responsibilities. So it was mostly young people who burst the gates, which means they were born into it, 67. They were born into it well after the occupation began. So I thought the analogy was right. And the more I read about the Nat Turner Rebellion, the more I thought it was correct, the analogy. And it seems to have, to some extent, I don't want to exaggerate, but it's gained some traction. When people discuss it, they discuss it in terms of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So I think it was right. I do sometimes wonder, because what Chomsky would have said after October 7th. Knowing him as I did, my guess is what he did with 9/11 in our own country. He said what happened was an atrocity. It was the biggest single atrocity that had occurred within a certain period of time. And then he immediately drops it and moves on and talks about why it happened and what the United States policy is, blah, 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 blah. But to put it this way, he would pass the Piers Morgan question. Do you condemn it? Yes, of course, like he condemned 9/11. But then he would proceed to say the U.S. did this. And remember, September 11th, 1973 was when the U.S. helped engineer the overthrow of Salvador Allende. And he would make all the September 11th, happened the date was just right. He would make all the analogies. So if I had said, no, I'll acknowledge what happened on October 7th, I will acknowledge it was horrible what happened, but I won't condemn Hamas. I refuse to do that because I don't believe they had any choice except to die, as it were, a slave. There was no, I know the history well, and I'll go tit for tat with anybody. They tried everything. They really did. They are who they are. They are Hamas, and they are a religious fundamentalist group, but they're also very practical. That's why they got elected in 2006. They were at that point, they were very honest, competent. They ran the charities and all sorts of organizations. There was actually a book written by none other than Sarah Roy, in which she describes what Hamas was on the ground. This was in the late 1990s, she wrote the book. And they were just a very honest, responsible organization. And that's why they were elected. And when they're in power, they realize that in order to survive, they have to make some compromises. And they did. They proceeded to try to find a diplomatic solution. They did. They tried to find a legal support. I'm not going to go into the details
it's now. Late 2010s, right?
It runs from, you could say, 2007 till 2000, maybe 12 or 14. They tried nonviolent civil resistance, the Great March of Return. They had exhausted all possibilities of finding any resolution to this conflict, which would, at bare minimum, forget about a global solution, which would just lift the blockade. Just lift the blockade. Many organizations commented one of the unique things about the situation in Gaza was there was nowhere to flee. As you know, there's a huge refugee population in the world, most of them fleeing elsewhere, fleeing here, fleeing there. They were incarcerated. They couldn't flee anywhere. To use the cliche, they were trapped like rats. So
what do you think Israel wants to happen to those people?
They want them to disappear.
But
they don't care. They don't quite care why, how. They wanted them to disappear. But they also wanted...
Because if they go to Egypt, that doesn't quote unquote solve the problem.
It displaces the problem. It doesn't solve it. But a large number of the Palestinian, not the majority, but those who fled, say, to the West, they'll feel a loyalty to the Palestinian refugee question, but they're not going to make the kinds of sacrifices. They've established new lives. So the hope was that they would be expelled, and slowly but surely the refugee question would vanish.
So that was the ideal end game, you think?
For
Tel Aviv.
Originally, the end game was initially.
I don't mean 1948,
Yeah.
I mean after October 7th.
Yeah, and they made it very clear. The end game was to expel Gaza's population to the Egyptian Sinai. The Arab states, in particular Egypt, said no. And so then their second end game was to make Gaza uninhabitable. So instead of a stampede, they'll disappear by a trickle. Until the end, the whole point of what was called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was they set up 4 sites. One was in central Gaza, and the other 3 were right on the border with Gaza, with the Sinai. That's the only place where food was being distributed. Get the whole population down. It was a mousetrap. And then they were still hoping until the very end to bomb them relentlessly so they'll, by hook or by crook, break through the border and go into Sinai. It didn't work. And I think President Trump gave them a timeline. If you can't do it by this time, then we have to end it. But ending it didn't mean ending. Ending it meant 2 things. We returned to the status quo ante October 7th with one big difference. Gaza's gone. There's nothing there. It's all rubble and dust. So the people, since we can say with 100% certainty, Israel having spent 2 years to pulverize Gaza, is not going to rebuild it while those people are still there. That's never going to happen. There are very few things I would say never, but that's one. That will never happen. So they'll have no choice but to go elsewhere. How? I don't know. But they achieved that goal. They couldn't get the stampede. But they said, if you read the statements, we're going to leave the people of Gaza 2 choices: to stay and starve or to leave. Stay and starve or to leave. And they were very straightforward. They said, we're going to annihilate all of Gaza. If you recall, right after October 7th, when Israel was issuing all of these public statements, it was very hard to defend those statements against the charge that Israel was committing genocide. So people said, no, it was just the heat of the moment. You can't imagine how angry they were. So they said things, blah, 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 blah. But now when you look back after 2 years, they did exactly what they said they would do. Block any food from going into Gaza, making Gaza uninhabitable, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants because all of Gaza is Hamas. If you go through the statements from the first couple of weeks, they weren't the product of momentary indignation. They were a war plan. It wasn't war, it was a genocide plan. They were very sober about what they were doing, and they knew exactly what they needed to do. So I think basically they didn't get that first goal, even though they were given quite a lot of time. namely to expel them, but they achieved the next best thing, which was to make Gaza uninhabitable. Now, you might ask as a technical question, is that a genocide? Because as you know, the definition of genocide is you have to show intent. So Gaza is a small little twist on the definition, doesn't change it at all, in my opinion. But Israel was prepared to use genocidal means to achieve the end of ethnic cleansing. They were prepared to kill every last person, if that's what it took to empty out Gaza. So it was a genocidal means to achieve an ethnic cleansing end. But that's still a genocide, because your intent is to exterminate as much of the population as is necessary to expel them. That's a genocide, in my opinion. I think, you have to, so to speak, tweak the formulation. And I thought through it a lot, because there are grounds for saying, well, their real aim is ethnic cleansing, their real aim isn't genocide, but that's not really true. The real aim was ethnic cleansing via genocide. Remember, genocide is the intent to physically destroy part or the whole of a racial, national, ethnic, or religious group. They were prepared part, and you know what? They were prepared whole. They were. There's no question in my mind about that. That they didn't have any sense of remorse. There wasn't even, and it's true, I believe, there wasn't even a sense of their committing a crime. There was not. I shouldn't use the past tense. There has not been any sense. When you take, and I know people will object, I'm making a narrow point here. When you take the case of the Nazis with the Nazi extermination, number one, they did it behind walls. The claim by many Germans, we didn't know. Well, actually, they did know quite a lot. Maybe they didn't know every fine detail, but they knew quite a lot. But at least you had the moral alibi. We didn't know. Okay? Secondly, there was some recognition that we're doing something wrong here. So you take the case of Heinrich Himmler in his famous speech in Posen in 1943. He's speaking to the Nazi troops. They're engaged in the extermination. And he gives this famous speech and says, "Oh, poor us Germans, poor us, that history has put the burden on us to rid the world of the Jews." That we had this horrible burden placed on our shoulders. But he didn't realize it was horrible. Now, obviously that's layered with quite a lot of irony. Poor us, that we had to execute the verdict of history and exterminate. You don't get that in the Israelis. There's no shame at all. None. There really is not. You couldn't fill a room this size with a number of people in Israel who on principle oppose what Israel is doing, who oppose on principle what Israel is doing. It's just not there. Oh, you could say, the demonstrations. The demonstrations were never about the people of Gaza. They were about whether or not to first free the hostages and then pursue what you want to pursue, or whether it should be reversed. We should pursue it regardless of whether the hostages get killed. But is anyone saying it's wrong to commit a genocide? No. I'm not saying it to demonize them. I really am not. But I'm trying to be faithful to the facts. You don't see that. There is no dissent like that. When they invoked the memory of Amalek, what was Amalek? Kill every man, woman, and child. Is there any remorse in doing that? No. It's not like, terrible, poor us, we have to kill Amalek. There's nothing like that. They deserved it. Remember what Amalek did to us? We're going to do it to them. They deserve it. And that's how they feel about the people in Gaza. They deserve it. They're vermin. They're Untermenschen. They're garbage. That's how the Israelis see it. Now you're going to say, I'm exaggerating. No, I've looked at a lot of the data, the polling data, and it's a very ugly picture. What has happened there? What does one conclude from it? I don't know. There are two sides. One side says people change. The world went from Germany being the hallmark of civilization in Europe to the Nazi Holocaust. And then after the Nazi Holocaust, it became, relatively speaking, it became a Pacific state for a period, a quite sustained period, post-war involvement, and so forth. It's no longer there, but it was. Same thing with Japan. Japan was a demonic state. During World War II, they killed 25 million Chinese. That's not a small number. They were as ruthless and barbaric as the Nazis, 25 million Chinese. But after World War II, they changed. I won't say completely changed, but there was change. So maybe Israelis will change. Maybe, I don't know. And the other possibility is Israel it was a historical, I know this word sounds so euphemistic, it was a historical error. It was just, it was a catastrophe. That experiment failed. It failed in ways which are kind of mind-boggling. When you read about Israeli soldiers targeting children in the skull and in the chest. I come across a figure every day in Gaza. Every day, 10 children lose one or both of their limbs. Amputations, often without anesthetic. Every day, 10 children have one or both legs amputated. It's the highest, densest concentration of amputees anywhere in the world. Those figures, those numbers, those realities, they're very hard to wrap your mind around.
Norman Finkelstein, it's been fantastic talking to you.
Thank
We'll
you.
get you back on again next year, I hope, in 2026.
My morbid side, if I'm still alive.